Let's go to Casey Hunt right now to give us an update on where things actually stand with the actual vote coming in on these competitive U.S. Senate races. Casey.
Sounds good, Jake. Let's start here in Florida, which has tightened since the last time we visited these numbers. 49.9% for the Democrat, Val Demings. About 13,000 or so votes separating her from incumbent Republican Senator Marco Rubio at 49.1%. So this is a much closer representation to where we actually expect this to be. But it's still very, very early in the night, only about 20-something% in of the vote in Florida. Now let's take a look at Georgia, where Warnock's still sitting up at 67.8%. That's about 145,000 votes ahead of the Republican Herschel Walker. But again, this is expected to be one of the closest races that we look at all night long. The question, does somebody hit 50% and avoid a runoff and 4 more weeks of this, Jake?
Polls are closing in 3 more states. 2 of them, Ohio and North Carolina, have high-stakes U.S. Senate races, so we're watching very closely. So here is a key race alert. CNN is saying it is too early to call. Congressman squaring off for an open U.S. Senate seat. Too early to call. In North Carolina, another open Senate seat from another Republican retiring. That race as well between Sherry Beasley and Congressman Ted Budd. That race also too early to call.
Let's get some key race alerts now, beginning with the state of Florida. Checked in, the former Republican governor turned Democratic Congressman Charlie Crist had the lead. Now it belongs to Ron DeSantis. More than 285,000 votes ahead, with 44% of the vote in Florida. Let's get an update now. Georgia, there, still very early, but legendary vote mobilizer Stacey Abrams is ahead. 73,000 votes against incumbent Republican Brian Kemp. Only 13% of the vote in there. So we will likely watch that potentially change throughout the night as we turn it over to Casey Hunt, who has some Senate races.
We sure will. Thank you very much, Boris. And I do want to start actually in Georgia. We are starting to get some numbers where we can compare things a little bit. So let's take a look at this. Raphael Warnock sitting at 60.1%. But look at that Herschel Walker number, 38.5%. That is different from gubernatorial candidate Brian Kemp, who sits at 42.6%. So again, we want to check with John King on this, but some early signs that perhaps as expected, Herschel Walker's underperforming Brian Kemp, the gubernatorial candidate there. We still expect this race to tighten considerably, only 13% of the vote in here. Let's go now to Florida, where Marco Rubio has taken the lead, probably as many of you expected. He's sitting now at 54% to Val Demings' 45%. Florida's going to count these votes relatively quickly. We've got 45% of the vote in there, but we're obviously going to keep watching it through the night. Let's go north now, though, to New Hampshire, where we are just starting to get votes in to this state, which swings so often with a wave when we see one. Maggie Hassan out to a relatively early lead. Again, there's only a few thousand votes in here, but she's sitting at 59.2% to Don Bolduc's 39.6%. This is one where Republicans started to take more interest, were encouraged by how things were moving late, but Hassan's team has been feeling good throughout the night so far. We've got 1% of the vote in New Hampshire, Jake.
The big Senate race in Pennsylvania, CNN is declaring to be too early to call, and the big Senate race, Governor John Fetterman and TV's Dr. Oz, too early to call as of right now. And in New Hampshire, a competitive race between incumbent Democratic Senator Maggie Hassan against retired General Don Bolduc. Again, too early to call. Let's look at the map in general right now. Right now, we have no projection in Connecticut, Illinois, Maryland, Missouri, and then, as I said, New Hampshire and Pennsylvania. Too early to call right now. The overall balance of power in the U.S. Senate, Democrats have 36 of the Senate seats. Republicans have 35 Senate seats. There are 29 seats remaining. That's what the rest of the night is about. Remember, Republicans only need to pick up 1 net seat from the Democrats in order to regain control of the Senate.
We also have a key race alert to bring you now. From the Peach State in Georgia, right now, Democratic activist Stacey Abrams, 44, it just changed, 38,000 votes ahead of incumbent Republican Brian Kemp. The lead thinning there with the last update, still only 31% of the vote in Georgia. We'll see where that winds up as the night moves along. Let's take a step back and look at the big picture. States where polls have closed, but where it is too early for CNN to make a projection. We're talking about Connecticut, Illinois, Maine, Maryland, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, as well as Rhode Island and the volunteer state of Tennessee. Let's turn it over now to Casey Hunt, who has some updates for us from Senate races. Casey.
Yeah, and Boris, let's start in Georgia because you just gave us an update on the governor's race there. Let's compare it to where things stand in the Senate race. Raphael Warnock up at 54.5% to Herschel Walker's 43.9%. So that spread between where the Republican Governor Kemp is at 48.2% right now has widened. Walker is just at 43.9%. That has to be giving some of the Democrats I've been talking to throughout the night a little bit of relief. We got, though, a third of the vote in here. We do, of course, expect this to be one of the tightest on the map. Let's take a look at North Carolina, where the Democrat Sherry Beasley has an early lead over Republican Ted Budd. Remember, this is retiring Republican Senator Richard Burr's seat, so a Democratic win here would represent a pickup for them, although we do expect this race to tighten through the evening. We have about 46% of the vote in North Carolina right now. Now let's go check in on Ohio, where the Democratic Congressman Tim Ryan is out to an early lead of 58.1% to the Republican J.D. Vance's 41.8%. With a spread that wide, we really do have to ask where those votes are coming from. We've only got about 20% of the vote in Ohio right now. And let's also check in on New Hampshire, where Maggie Hassan is at 64.1% to the Republican Don Baldock's 35.4%. She's about 13,000 votes ahead, so that tells you where we are in the vote count. We're not very far in. We are at 8%, but you'd rather be Maggie Hassan at this hour than Don Baldock, Jake.
It is too early to call between incumbent Senator John Boozman and Democrat Natalie James. Too early to call at this moment right now. Let's take a look at the balance of power right now in the U.S. Senate. Democrats hold 36 seats. Republicans hold 36 seats as well. 28 seats remain. Remember, you need 51 seats to control the U.S. Senate. Republicans need to pick up one net seat from the Democrats in order to win control of the U.S. Senate.
Beginning with that all-important race we will not stop talking about in Georgia. The last time we checked, Stacey Kemp, the incumbent Republican, leads with roughly 40,000 votes, with 42% of the vote in. Notably, Kemp above the 50% threshold, meaning runoff. Let's get a look at Texas now. Democratic Congressman Beto O'Rourke right now over incumbent Republican Greg Abbott, about 26% of the vote in Texas. An update now, a key race alert from the state of Michigan. Incumbent Democrat Gretchen Whitmer, I should say, locked in a now. Whitmer sitting 55,000 votes ahead, still very, very early in the night in Michigan, only 3% of the vote in there. We also have a key race alert to bring you from the state of 287,000 vote advantage over Doug Mastriano. Remember, Mastriano's an election denier who tried to overturn the 2020 election results in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Still early there, though, only 8% of the vote in. Let's turn it over to my friend Casey Hunt, who has an update for us on Senate races. Casey.
And you know what, Boris? We've got some really interesting comparisons to show you between what we just learned about the governor's races and where we stand here in the Senate. And let's start in Georgia, where Raphael Warnock is leading, 51.9% to Herschel Walker's 46.4%. Just to refresh, the governor's race looks the opposite. Kemp at 50.9, Abrams at 48.6. That really shows you the difference here in terms of performance. We got 43% of the vote in Georgia. We expect it to stay close all evening. Now let's check in on North Carolina. Beasley is at 52%. You just heard that great breakdown from John King about where the votes are still out. There is reason for the Budd campaign to potentially be optimistic here. We're going to be sticking close to this all night. 55% of the vote in there. Now let's go to Ohio, where Tim Ryan is out to an early lead, 56.9% to J.D. Vance's 3%, but it is still extremely early in Ohio. And of course, this is a state that has trended very red in recent years. We've got 29% of the vote in Ohio. But now let's go to New Hampshire, where Maggie Hassan is sitting at 60.7% to Don Baldock's 1%. Democrats in New Hampshire telling me they feel very good about where Maggie Hassan is at this hour. But of course, it's extremely early. Just 14.9% of the vote has been counted in New Hampshire. But now let's check in on Pennsylvania. Compare these numbers here to what Boris just told us in the governor's race. John Fetterman at 17.9%. Obviously, the race is going to end much closer than where it stands right now. But Shapiro is sitting at 84%. governor. That gives you a little bit of an idea of how Fetterman is underperforming Shapiro, which has been the concern for Democrats all the way along, that potential ticket splitters, especially in the Philadelphia collar counties, would pick Mehmet Oz for Senate and Shapiro for governor. Jake.
All right, Casey, thanks so much. Really appreciate that. We've been telling you all night there are about 82 House seats that are competitive, races that are competitive, that we're really keeping an eye on, because it is in those 82 races that the balance of power in the House of Representatives will be won or lost. Let's give you an update right now. Right now, of the 23 competitive seats that are too early to call, the voting has ended, but they're too early to call. Democrats are leading in 15 of them. Republicans are leading in 8 of them. It's early yet. That doesn't necessarily mean Democrats are going to win 15 of them, but that is the state of play as of right now. Races that we are not yet going to make a projection, they include the Senate races in Arizona, Colorado, Iowa, Louisiana, North Dakota, and Wisconsin. As of right now, we do not have a projection in those races. The balance of power, of course, 100 Senate seats. Democrats have 37 of those seats. Republicans have 38 of those seats. There are 25 seats remaining. Republicans only need to pick up one net seat in order to regain control of the U.S. Senate.
To bring you now, beginning with the state of Texas. Last time we checked, a decent advantage right now. Greg Abbott, the incumbent Republican, has overtaken him, nearly 170,000 vote lead for Abbott with 33% of the vote in. An update now from the Peach State, Georgia. Brian Kemp building on the lead that we saw him take earlier. He stands 100% advantage for Kemp, still above that 50% threshold to avoid a runoff, with 55% of the vote in Georgia. Meantime, an unexpectedly close race in Oklahoma. A key race alert there. Kevin Stitt, the incumbent Republican, taking on Joy Hoffmeister, a Democrat who actually flipped parties just last year specifically for this race. Stitt right now, 43,000 votes ahead with 34% of the vote in. Jake.
It sure does, John King. Thanks so much. Voting is about to end in 3 more states, including Nevada, another key battleground that could tip the scale in the fight for the control of the U.S. Senate. We have a key race alert for you now. It is too early to call the U.S. Senate race in Nevada between Senator Cortez Masto and Mr. Laxalt, Adam Laxalt. It is too early to call. We do not have any information for you there to project. In terms of Utah, between incumbent Republican Senator Mike Lee and his challenger, Independent Evan McMullin, also too early to call. The balance of power in the U.S. Senate, as we've been telling you all night, this is key. There are 40 Democratic senators, 40 Republican senators, 20 seats outstanding. That is what we are going to be spending the rest of the night focusing on. Republicans need to pick up one net seat in order to regain control of the U.S. Senate. But right now, it's tied 40-40.
Key race alerts to bring you now. Beginning in the state of Texas, Republican incumbent Greg Abbott building on his lead. He's now 368,000 votes ahead of Beto O'Rourke with 58% of the vote in the Lone Star State. Let's get a look at Michigan right now. Gretchen Whitmer, roughly the same place, maybe a slimmer advantage than the last time we checked in on her contest with Tudor Dixon. 36,000 votes ahead for the Democratic incumbent with 16% of the vote in. An update now, again from Georgia. Brian Kemp there, 247,000 votes ahead of Stacey Abrams. Notable in this rematch, last time around, Kemp only won by about 50,000 votes. This is a much bigger lead, and as you just saw, he added another 1,000 votes to that advantage with 77% of the vote in Georgia. We finish with Wisconsin. The key race alert there, 85,000 votes separating these two candidates. Tony Evers, the incumbent, holding on to an advantage over election denier Tim Michels, 35% of the vote in Wisconsin. And as we turn it over to Casey Hunt, we have to point out there's also a big Senate race in Wisconsin as well.
There sure is, Boris. We're going to walk across the map here. I want to start, take a guess, Georgia, which is where we've been talking about all night. Raphael Warnock back in the lead by 0.1%. Look at that. 2,300 or so votes separating Warnock from Herschel Walker at this hour. We've got 77% of the vote in, but I think it's very obvious to everybody watching this could go either way. Let's take a look at Wisconsin. We obviously just saw what Boris was pointing out. It's similar on the Senate side. Mandela Barnes, the Democrat, sitting at 51.8%, but that is not as strong as the gubernatorial candidate. Ron Johnson, the incumbent Republican, at 48%. We expect this to be one of the closest Senate contests throughout the night. We've only got 34% of the vote in, so keep watching that one. Pennsylvania, let's check back in. This has changed pretty dramatically since the last time we really looked at it. John Fetterman is now at 52.1% to Mehmet Oz's 45.4%. This is starting to look a lot more like we expect it to look as they count the votes, perhaps over the next couple of days, depending on how close it remains. Right now, about 146,000 votes separating them. Fetterman has been underperforming the Democratic candidate in the governor's race, Josh Shapiro, so another thing to keep an eye on. Let's check in on Ohio, where J.D. Vance has expanded his lead a little bit over Democrat Tim Ryan, the congressman who's challenging him. This is, of course, retiring Republican Rob Portman's seat, so if Vance can hang on to this lead, it'll represent a Republican hold, 53.4% to Ryan's 46.6%. We still do, of course, have about 30% of the vote outstanding there. Now let's go down to North Carolina, where Ted Budd is still leading Democrat Sherry Beasley, 50.8% to Sherry Beasley's 47.1%. Retiring Republican Richard Burr has this seat right now, so this would represent a Republican hold. This has been pretty steady for the past couple of hours, but the vote count creeping upward. We're now at 83% in North Carolina. And let's check back in New Hampshire. This is one that a lot of people were looking to for signs of potentially an early Republican wave if Don Bolduc, the Republican, had a particularly strong showing. So far, that's just not happening. Maggie Hassan is at 57.2%, Bolduc down at 41.5%. Now, granted, we still only have about 40% of the vote in there, so things could still change. But I will say Democrats are saying good things about New Hampshire right now on the Senate side, Jake.
Well, it's a nice state. Of course they're saying nice things. Let's take a look at the balance of power right now in the competitive seats. Remember, we're looking at 82 competitive House seats. We're not going to look at all 435. There are 82 competitive ones. Of those 82, there are 51 competitive seats that we think are too early to call. Right now, in those 51, Democrats are leading in 39 of them. Republicans are leading in 12 of them. It's early. We do not know that this is going to be determinative. But this is certainly, if you're a Democrat watching at home, better news than what a lot of Republicans were hoping for at this point in the night. From Ohio, taking the place of retiring Republican Senator Rob Portman. The balance of power right now, 100 seats in the Senate, 43 of them belong to Democrats, 45 of them belong to Republicans, 12 seats remain. All Republicans need to do is pick up one net Democratic seat, and they will be able to wrest control of the U.S. Senate. 100 Senate votes. Democrats have 44 of them. Republicans have 46 of them. There are 10 seats remaining. 10 seats remaining. And CNN reminds you, of course, that Republicans just need to pick up one net Republican seat and one net Democratic seat in order to take control of the U.S. Senate. So that's where we are, 44 to 46. And Casey Hunt has some announcements for us at the Senate desk.
We do, Jake, and this really shows you, to John King's point, that we are getting down to the brass tacks here in the Senate as we try to figure out which way it's going to go, perhaps by one seat. And let's start, as always, in Georgia, where Herschel Walker has a very narrow lead over Raphael Warnock, just 15,000 votes, which is such a small amount considering the millions that have been cast. We've got 88% of the vote in there, election officials saying we might not know tonight. Pennsylvania. John Fetterman at 49.2%, Mehmet Oz at 48.3%, 37,000 votes separating them, again, among millions cast. And this race is one that we're going to be counting potentially for days here. And as John outlined, this is what will save Democrats if they lose that race out in Nevada, which Republicans are very confident about, and give them a shot to actually retain control. 75% of the vote in Pennsylvania at this hour. Now let's check in on Wisconsin, which remains very close, 51% for the incumbent Ron Johnson over the Democrat Mandela Barnes at 48.8%. This remains very, very close. Mandela Barnes has been underperforming the Democratic Governor Evers so far tonight. Only about we're at 69% of the vote, so we've only got about 30% out of the vote outstanding. Now let's check in on Arizona, where Mark Kelly is sitting pretty comfortably right now, 58%. Over Blake Masters, the Republican, at 39.7%. That's a 240 or so thousand vote gap. I want to check in with John King and David Chalian to figure out what kind of votes are outstanding, because there's only about 50% of the vote in Arizona, and we could see that tighten up. But now we're going to turn to Boris, who's got some critical updates on the governor's race.
Yeah, Casey, it's really interesting, as you pointed out, the lead for the Republican in the Senate race in Wisconsin. As we get you a key race alert from that state, The Democratic incumbent in the governor's race is currently leading. Right now, Tony Evers, 43,000 votes ahead of election questioner Tim Michaels. It just changed. Now it's a 45,000 vote advantage with 69% of the vote in Wisconsin. We want to update you on the state of Michigan right now. Gretchen Whitmer, nearly 90,000 votes ahead of conservative commentator Tudor Dixon. It just changed again. Now it's 88,000 votes. The lead slightly thinning there for Gretchen Whitmer with 39% of the vote in Michigan. In Kansas, perhaps the most vulnerable Democratic incumbent running for re-election, Laura Kelly, in a state that Donald Trump won by about 15 percentage points. She currently leads against Derek Schmidt, an election denier. 32,000 vote advantage for Laura Kelly with 83% of the vote in Kansas. Meantime, the most unusual governor's race you're going to see on the map tonight, a three-way race between Tina Kotek, a Democrat, Christine Drazan, a Republican, and former Democrat turned independent Betsy Johnson, right now the Democrat in this race, with an 18,600 vote advantage, 53% of the vote in there. We send it back over to Jake Tapper. Jake.
Thank you so much, Boris. And I just want to remind everybody of the competitive seats. There are 82 competitive seats. Republicans have to win 23 of them, and they are leading in 22 of them. So that's for control of the U.S. House. Republicans on their way. Of the 23 competitive seats they have to win, they're currently leading in 22. What about Democrats? What do Democrats have to do? They have to win 49 of the 82 competitive seats, 49 of them. And right now they are leading in 42 of them. Not bad, but not as close as where the Republicans are. And I want you to take a look at some of these margins right now when it comes to these House races. In Oregon, Alex Skarlatos is ahead by 0.08%. In Iowa, Zach Nunn up by 0.18%. In California, Congresswoman Michelle Steele up by 0.4%. In New York, Molinaro up 0.67%. In Arizona, Eli Crane up 1.38%. And Democrats, too, their leads are pretty narrow as well. We're looking at Kermit Jones up by 0.06% in California, and Tony Vargas up by 0.15% in Nebraska. Congressman Ryan is up by 0.36% in New York. Tom Malinowski in New Jersey up by only 0.88%. And then Connecticut, Jahana Hayes up by 1.72%. These are competitive seats, and the margins of victory right now are so narrow.
Which is to say that Georgia remains as close as ever. 20,000 votes separating Herschel Walker from Raphael Warnock right now. Excuse me. Neither one of them above 50% with 90% of the vote in. This could stretch out for 4 weeks. In Pennsylvania, this continues to tighten. John Fetterman, 49.3%. Mehmet Oz, 48.2%. Remember, this would be a Democratic pickup if Fetterman were to win here, which would protect Democrats if they lost elsewhere on the map, say in Nevada, perhaps, where Republicans feel very good about their chances. But we've got 84% of the vote in, and the count is going to keep going in Pennsylvania. Now let's check in on Wisconsin, where Ron Johnson is maintaining his lead, the Republican incumbent, over Democrat Mandela Barnes, who sits at 48.4%. So right now, we've always expected this race to be very, very close. Johnson is really doing what he needs to do at this hour, 80% of the vote in Wisconsin. And let's check in now on Arizona, where Mark Kelly is sitting at 57.8% to the Republican Blake Masters, 39.9%. That's a pretty comfortable lead. I think we need to know a little bit more about where the vote is still outstanding in Arizona. Let's now check in on Utah. This is a really interesting one. Mike Lee, the incumbent Republican, at 53.7%. He is facing a challenge from independent Evan McMullin. You may remember him from his brief presidential bid. He was in the CIA. He is someone who has mounted a challenge to Lee, hasn't said who he would conference with. Mitt Romney has stayed out of this race. So far, McMullin is behind Lee, but that's a strong number for an independent running in a situation like this, Jake.
Let's look at these other two races right now that are very interesting as votes are coming in. In Colorado's 7th and 3rd congressional district, Lauren Boebert, the incumbent Republican congresswoman, a firebrand, some would say an extremist, is currently losing. She's 8,551 votes behind her Democratic challenger, Adam Frisch, with 80% of the vote in. That is a surprising result as of now. It is not the end. We're still looking at the votes. They're still counting them. And then in New York, at the 17th congressional district, Sean Maloney, who is in addition to being an incumbent congressman, he is the chairman of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. He is losing with 85% of the vote in to Michael Lawler, a local state representative.
This alerts now 4 races where Democrats are defeating either election deniers or election questioners, starting with Arizona. Katie Hobbs right now 172,000 votes ahead of Kari Lake, 52% of the vote in Arizona. Let's get an update now from Michigan. Gretchen Whitmer, the incumbent Democrat, 133,000 votes ahead of conservative commentator Tudor Dixon, 62% of the vote in Michigan. As we take a look at Wisconsin, a very close race there. Joe Biden won this state by only about 20,000 votes last time. That's roughly the advantage that incumbent Democrat Tony Evers has right now, about 25,000 votes ahead of Tim Michels, with 83% of the vote in Wisconsin. We also have an update to bring you in the state of Kansas. This race, very, very close. Incumbent Democrat Laura Kelly, perhaps the most vulnerable incumbent Democrat on the entire map, 24,000 votes ahead right now of Derek Schmidt, with 86% of the vote in Kansas.
As it seems this evening in that same state, which is Georgia. Raphael Warnock has actually ticked into the lead here, but man, look how close this is. 12,631 votes right now of literally millions. You can see it on the screen, separating Warnock from Walker. Again, both under 50%. The question remains, can someone get to the point where they avoid a runoff, or are we looking at 4 more weeks of this fight that we have seen? 94% of the vote in Georgia. Let's check in now on Pennsylvania, which is turning out to be our other linchpin. John Fetterman, 49.2%. Mehmet Oz, 48.3%. You heard Jake and John King really breaking down where some of the votes are out. Here, Fetterman seems to be outperforming what Biden did in some of the rural counties, but we're still waiting on those big numbers in counties like Philadelphia. 88% of the vote in, but this really could be where the Senate hinges. Now let's take a look at Wisconsin. Ron Johnson sitting at 51.6%. He is doing better than the Republican gubernatorial candidate, and Mandela Barnes is underperforming the sitting governor, Tony Evers, 51.6% to 48.2% for this race. Still very close, but Johnson right now doing what he needs to do with 83% of the vote in here. Now let's check in on Arizona, where Mark Kelly is sitting at 57.2%. Pretty comfortable lead over Blake Masters, who's got 40.5%. It's tightened a little bit since the last time we took a look at this. We really need to know where we're still waiting on votes to fully understand what this means at this hour of the night. We've got 53% of the vote in Arizona, Jake.
Casey Hunt, tell us what's going on in the U.S. Senate.
Yeah, so the question is, who is doing what they need to do to pick up that one critical seat or hold it if you're the Democrats? And we actually want to make a little change here and start in Pennsylvania, where John Fetterman is holding his lead as the votes are rolling in, 49.4 to 48.1%. Look at that. We've got nearly 90% of the vote in Pennsylvania. And of course, if we've still got a lot of vote out in Philadelphia, that's going to be critical. This would make up for a Republican loss, potentially in a state like Nevada, and allow us to focus in on Georgia, because the Senate control could again come down to this race. And if it goes to a runoff, if these numbers hold the way they are, then of course we've got 4 more weeks of questions about who's in charge. Raphael Warnock, the incumbent, currently sitting at 49.2%. Herschel Walker at 48.7%. As John King was walking us through, Democrats are optimistic that Warnock may be able to pull this out based on where the outstanding vote still is. But we have seen this stick below 50% really all night, and 95% of the vote is in Georgia. All right, let's head now to Wisconsin. We'll check in on Ron Johnson. This race has been held in pretty steady, 50.6% for the incumbent Republican to the Democrat Mandela Barnes, 49.2%. 88% of the vote now in Wisconsin. And finally, let's take a quick look at Nevada. So this is a place that Democrats have been worried about all night. Early numbers show Catherine Cortez Masto holding at 54.3% to the Republican Adam Laxalt at 43%, but only 44% of the vote has been counted here. And the Democrats I've been talking to all evening have been concerned about their performance in Clark County. So we're going to have to check in and see where the votes are out there. But now, Boris, I know you've got some critical updates for us in the governor's race.
Yeah, and we're going to get you an update on the gubernatorial race in Nevada as well. But first, let's take a look at the state of Michigan. Incumbent Democrat Gretchen Whitmer locked in a tough re-election battle against conservative commentator Tudor Dixon. Right now, she holds about a 6% advantage, 166,000 vote lead with 66% of the vote in Michigan. Let's get a look now at the state of Arizona. The Secretary of State there, Katie Hobbs, 166,000 votes ahead of former TV anchor and election denier Kari Lake, 54% of the vote in Arizona. Let's take a look at that Nevada governor's race now, because Steve Sisolak, the incumbent Democrat, facing some very strong economic headwinds. Inflation is disproportionately affecting people in Nevada compared to other states. He's currently leading the sheriff of Clark County, Joe Lombardo, by about 43,000 votes, with 44% of the vote in there. We have an update for you, a key race alert from Wisconsin as well. Incumbent Democrat Tony Evers, last time we checked in, his lead was at about 25,000 votes. Now it's at about 73,000 votes over Tim Michels, with 88% of the vote in Wisconsin. And it just changed again, that lead thinning by about 2,000 votes for Evers. Let's get an update for you from perhaps the weirdest governor's race you're going to see tonight in the state of Oregon. This is a three-way race between these three women: Tina Kotek, the Democrat, Christine Drazen, the Republican, and former Democrat turned independent Betsy Johnson, who could potentially play spoiler for the Democrats tonight, opening the door for Drazen to become the first Republican in 40 years to become governor of Oregon. But right now, Kotek is in the lead by about 13,000 votes, with 65% of the vote in. As we send it back to Jake Tapper, only a 1 percentage point difference in that race, Jake. Katie Hobbs is leading the unrepentant election denier Kari Lake, 164,000 votes, with 54% of the vote in the state of Arizona. Let's take a look at Nevada now. Steve Sisolak, a very vulnerable Democratic incumbent. Right now, he stands 43,000 votes ahead of the sheriff of Clark County, Joe Lombardo, 44% of the vote in the state of Nevada. Let's get another look at Michigan. Gretchen Whitmer has steadily been building this lead every time we've checked in on this race. She now stands 187,000 votes ahead of conservative commentator Tudor Dixon, 71% of the vote in the state of Michigan. We take a look now at the state of Kansas. This is perhaps the reddest state in which a Democrat gubernatorial candidate was running for re-election. Laura Kelly, 22,000 votes ahead of Derek Schmidt, who questioned the results of the 2020 election. 87% of the vote in Kansas. Let's send it over to Jake Tapper and John King at the Magic Wall.
Casey Hunt, we go to you now with more on the battle for the Senate.
Well, Jake, we can walk through what the possibilities are for Republicans right now and what they aren't. Let's start in Georgia, where Raphael Warnock is still barely ahead of Herschel Walker, the Republican. So this is one where, again, if this holds, we're looking at 4 more weeks of fighting. This could, of course, go either way under those kinds of circumstances. It could all come down to the race here, depending on what happens on the rest of the map. 96% of the vote in there. And let's look at what else is out. Wisconsin, Ron Johnson, the incumbent, sitting at 50.7. This has been pretty steady here as the vote has continued to roll in, that this margin is about the same. Mandela Barnes at 49.1%. We obviously have called the Wisconsin governor's race for the Democrat, but Ron Johnson is on a different path right now with 80% of the vote in there. Let's check in on Nevada, where, of course, Democrats have been pessimistic, or at least they were at the beginning of the night, but obviously their optimism has increased as results have rolled in through the evening. Catherine Cortez Masto currently at 53.3% to the Republican Adam Laxalt's 44%. We have 53% of the vote in here in Nevada. A lot of questions about whether it's mail or how that's all coming in. We're going to have to go to John King and David Chalian for some of those answers. So let's check in on Arizona, where Mark Kelly sitting comfortably ahead of the Republican Blake Masters at 57.2% to Blake Masters 40.5%. If this kind of lead can hold, Democrats can hold there. We're looking at that trio of races, Nevada and Georgia, perhaps Wisconsin, as this night gets later and later, Jake.
All right, Casey, we're tracking the Senate races that are still undecided, including those nail-biters in Georgia and Wisconsin. The battle for control of the U.S. Senate still too early to call. Our coverage continues after this.
We're going to start with 2 key race alerts. First up in Wisconsin, that's where incumbent Republican Ron Johnson is holding on to a very slim lead over Democrat Mandela Barnes. A very slim lead there, 50.7% to 49.1%. Mandela Barnes with 49.1%, Ron Johnson with 50.7%. Let's take it to Nevada that you see right here as well. Catherine Cortez Masto with 50.9%. Adam Laxalt, 46.3%. Those are in the Senate races in Wisconsin and Nevada. 62% of the votes have been counted. This is CNN's continuing coverage of election night in America. At this hour, control of Congress still at stake, and the balance of power in the House has been decided. Many of the races really just too close to call. But now I want to take a look at where we are as it concerns the balance of power in the House. First of the House, the party with the at least 218 seats. That will be the majority in the House. Republicans leading with about 195 seats at this hour. They need to win 19 competitive seats to gain control. Democrats have 176 at this point. Let's check the Senate now, the balance of power there. The chamber still hangs in the balance. Republicans still hoping to gain control of the Senate. And at this moment, all eyes are on 4 Senate races: Wisconsin, Nevada, Georgia, and Arizona. There are still no projections in those races. In Nevada, Senator Catherine Cortez Masto, the Democrat, leading at this hour. In Wisconsin, Democrat Mandela Barnes trails Republican Senator Ron Johnson. And in Arizona, where incumbent Mark Kelly is facing Blake Masters, right now they're separated by, get this, about 140,000 votes. Let's head to Georgia now. That's where Republican Herschel Walker and incumbent Democratic Senator Raphael Warnock, they are very, very, very close. I understand we got some new votes in. We'll head to John Berman in just a bit. If no candidate gets to 50% of the vote, that race could go to a runoff to Secretary of State. They're already predicting that. In Pennsylvania, a huge night for Democrat John Fetterman. CNN is projecting that he has defeated Mehmet Oz, the famous TV doctor. This is after Fetterman had a stroke on the campaign trail, recovered, and then, of course, an endorsement from Oprah Winfrey.